Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you're safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on a variety of issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm really pleased to welcome to the program Amos Harel. Haaretz is a senior military analyst, and in my view, the best defense and security analyst of Israel's national security policies. Amos's commentaries and analysis are particularly astute and insightful because he understands the political context. And when it comes to Israel, with respect to its national security and its foreign policy, I think the challenge was best summed up by the late Henry Kissinger, who once quipped that Israel had no foreign policy, only domestic politics. An exaggeration to be sure, but more than a little truth inside. But let me introduce Amos. As I mentioned, he's one of Israel's leading media experts on military and defense issues. He's been the military correspondent and defense analyst for Haaretz for the last 25 years. Prior to this role, he served in any number of capacities, night editor for Haaretz. He's also been an anchorman on a weekly radio program about defense issues broadcast by the IDF. He's also a co-author of a bestseller with Avi Sakharov called The Seventh War, How We Won and Why We Lost the War with Palestinians. It is the winner, Amos, if I'm not pronouncing this correctly, of the Chechik Award.
Mm-hmm.
Did I get that right? Or is that a ch in Hebrew? Did I get that right?
Yeah, you did.
At any rate, it was voted for the most outstanding security research in 2005. And he co-authored again with the inestimable Avi Sakharov a second book, 34 Days, Israel, Hezbollah, and the War in Lebanon, about the summer of 2006, 18 years ago, which for 34 days, Hezbollah, then without the depth of inventory of high trajectory weapons, managed to shut down the northern half of Israel. Maybe that's too strong.
Northern third, I'd say. Yeah.
For 34 days. Amos also won the Sokolov Award, which is Israel's most prestigious prize for excellence in journalism. He's got a bachelor's degree in law studies from Tel Aviv University, 1995. Amos, let me welcome you to Carnegie Connects.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you for inviting me.
I want to start with the Northern Front. That's the one that's obviously hottest. We're on the cusp, perhaps, of a significant, serious escalation. You know, I was just thinking that Middle East wars don't happen by accident. They're either well-planned or not well-planned, 1956, 1973, or they're preceded by a long fuse of tensions, which ultimately is ignited through a mass casualty event, a miscalculation, some event. So I'm wondering about this latest phase, where we stand right now. The two events that seem to prefigure the possibility of an escalation, the Israeli strike against a very senior Hezbollah official in the southern suburbs of Beirut, and the strike against Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. I wonder if you could put that in context for us. Talk a little bit about each strike and what it was designed to achieve, and what the implications might be.
Okay. Right now, we're sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's been more than a week since two assassinations happened. I should note that Israel didn't take public responsibility for the second one in Tehran. But as you mentioned, Fuad Shukr, a close advisor of Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader, and a man who was described by the Israelis as the chief of staff of Hezbollah's military wing, was assassinated in Beirut, either drones or attack planes. But the building he was in was blown up, and he died there. I think it was late on Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken, last week. And then within a few hours, Ismail Haniyeh, who went to Tehran, it was the leader of Hamas abroad, and perhaps not the most important man in Hamas, because Yahya Sinwar is actually more important right now, leading Hamas in Gaza. But Haniyeh was in more or less in exile for quite a few years, having trouble or perhaps not wanting to go back to the Gaza Strip. And he was usually he spends time in Qatar, but he came to Tehran to attend the swearing in of a new Iranian president, and then died while he was a guest of the Iranian regime. The apartment he was staying there was blown up. Now it's clearer that this was done by explosives and not, and that he was not he was not killed with a missile. So within 5-6 hours, 2 major assassinations. As I said, Israel only taking responsibility for the first one, but this was seen as a massive blow for Iran and for Hezbollah. And in both cases, Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, and Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader, were very quick to threaten Israel with a massive response. And yet, as I said, 8 days have passed and this hasn't happened yet. Nasrallah spoke yesterday in Beirut, and he said that this was part of the plan, that they were intentionally getting on Israel's nerves and trying to scare the Israeli public, the Israeli leadership, and that revenge would come. I think that it would be a different kind of retaliation. The Hezbollah's revenge would probably be harsher and more dangerous for Israel and the region than what the Iranians are currently planning.
Right. We're going to get to that. I just on timing, I have two questions to raise. You know, the April 13, 14 Iranian retaliation presumably occurred 2 weeks after the Israelis struck a complex or an annex in Damascus, killing a senior IRGC general. The strike against Haniyeh was July 31, I think. So it's 8 days. So you might think that this could occur between now and the next several days. But before we get on to what that strike might look like, the strike against Fuad Shukr, I think, was easily explained by the Hezbollah strike, whether it was an errant missile or not, in Majd al-Shams, which was the single greatest casualty event in the north since October 7 on the Israeli side, Druze children and teens. What was the thinking, Amos, behind the strike against Haniyeh? I think I could answer the question, why Tehran, but why now?
Look, we have to look at the consequences for Israelis of October 7th. You've heard that before, the worst day for the Jewish people in the state of Israel since the Holocaust. This is a shock, and this is a country still shell-shocked 10 months to the day of the Hamas attack. And Israel immediately after that swore that it would chase every one of the people involved in a way which is slightly similar to the retaliation after the massacre of Israeli sportsmen, athletes in the Olympic Games in Munich in 1972. Now, Haniyeh, as far as we know, was not directly involved in the decision-making or the military planning of the October 7th attack. And yet he is a symbol. He's a well-known political leader for Hamas, and he was, to an extent, something between their president and prime minister in exile. And he was the man who represented them, whether in Tehran or whether in Moscow or whether in Doha, and so on. And there's a famous video of the Hamas leadership in Qatar celebrating the comrades' achievement, so to speak, with the massacre on October 7th in Doha at a hotel room, and then praying immediately as a sort of a prayer, thanks to Allah, or something similar immediately after that. And this was an image that has struck Israelis quite hard. And I think that Netanyahu announcing, and then Mossad chief Barnea as well, both announced that Israel would retaliate and that Israel would settle the score with each and every one of those Hamas leaders. So I would assume, again, I have to assume that this is an Israeli strike against Haniyeh, again, without Israel taking full responsibility. I would assume that this is the case, that this is about an operational opportunity, taking advantage of certain circumstances, perhaps the operational people telling Netanyahu, this is your chance. If you want one of those senior Hamas leaders killed in the near future, this is the window of opportunity and we have to use it. And yet, looking at Netanyahu for quite some time, you've known him for many more years than I do, one would suspect the motives and the calculation behind such a decision, assuming that it was taken by him. Because in the end, doing this a few hours after Shukr in Beirut means something else to the Iranian axis, and probably it took the whole Middle East in another direction right now. Remember where we were, not that we were in any safe or good place, but 2 weeks ago, we were discussing the possibility of a hostage deal. And Netanyahu was under enormous pressure from Biden to move forward finally with the deal. And now nobody in Israel has discussed the poor hostages in the last week. Everybody's concerned about, as I said, about the other shoe dropping.
I mean, whether or not the prime minister consulted Israeli intelligence to provide an assessment as to what the impact of hitting Haniyeh now against the backdrop of the inauguration of the new Iranian president in Iran, exposing massive security vulnerabilities and operational security failures on the Iranian side, what the impact could be. I mean, we still don't know, right, where we're going with this. So, I mean, giving Benjamin Netanyahu the benefit of the doubt is not something people want to do or are willing or able to do, given the fact that time and again, it appears as if Prime Minister may not want a major war, but keeping the pot boiling may well be a part of his political calculation. There's no doubt. So we'll see how the shoes drop on this one. But to say that people were surprised, perhaps even stunned by the second assassination, I think would be an understatement. But let's get to the first shoe. I think you reported your analysis. You think that Hezbollah will take the leading edge of the response that is coming. Maybe a strike at a military facility or a piece of infrastructure in the north, or even in and around Tel Aviv. Would that be your assessment, at least, of one possible Hezbollah response?
I think that this is where we're heading, and I'm basing this both on an analysis of what Nasrallah himself has been saying, on some reports in Lebanese media from people who are close to Nasrallah, and also on Israeli intelligence. Of course, I can be entirely wrong on that, and we've seen the Israeli intelligence community getting it very wrong just recently. And yet the assumption is that Nasrallah feels obligated to act. This was a man very close to him. He's about his age. He was actually more of a Hezbollah veteran than Nasrallah himself. He was involved in attacks against Americans as well in 82, 83, and so on. The familiar events you remember, the attack against the Marines and so on. So he's one of the founding members of the military wing of Hezbollah, a close friend of Munir, and so on. So this is somebody who's important to Nasrallah, and in a way more senior than the other three major commanders who were assassinated by Israel during the last 10 months. So Nasrallah has to act, and Nasrallah is already committed to attack in his speeches. He already gave two very long speeches that mostly focused on this matter since the assassination. Now, regarding the waiver they intend to act, the assumption is that they'll try to a sort of a battering of Israeli military bases closer to the border, anywhere from Tzfat towards the border. This will be attacked. They will probably try to differentiate between military targets and civilian targets. They may hit civilians unintentionally, but I don't think that Hezbollah would go for Israeli population centers intentionally, because this would mean an all-out war. This is very, very clear. And then, according to Nasrallah's hints, and also the fact that he's a firm believer in what he calls equations. If you hit Beirut, I hit Tel Aviv. He mentioned that months and months ago, and he kept threatening Israel that Israel should not touch the Dakhya, the Shiite quarter in southern Beirut that you mentioned earlier. Well, this is exactly where Shukr was killed. So I think that Nasrallah would be tempted to hit the Tel Aviv area, and yet he has to look for a military target. You can think of the Glilot bases north of Tel Aviv. You can think of the Kiryat, where the Ministry of Defense is and the army headquarters, but this is very, very close to civilian neighborhoods and civilian centers and so on. But one of those bases in the area could be a place where they will show their capabilities, where they will show how far they've gotten since the war in 2006 that you mentioned earlier. So I think Israel is preparing for that. And you have to remember that we have improved as well, especially considering our defense systems, our rockets intercepting systems. But this may not only be rockets. What we've seen recently is that Hezbollah has been very, very successful applying drones to such attacks, mostly in the north. So we are expecting something relatively big. Now, regarding Iran, it's hard to tell. From the recent messages, and again, the messaging is unclear, and it's very, very difficult to calculate or explain what exactly is going on. But the assumption right now is that Iran is not as keen as it was before. Things have cleared out a little. If you read the Washington Post today, David Ignatius quoting people from the Biden administration saying that Iran has gotten received messages from Washington to be careful. And therefore, I would assume that this would be perhaps something similar to April 14th, and perhaps even less than that, because again, in the end, the victim of the attack was Palestinian and not Iranian.
Right. I mean, geography is destiny, right? So the real damage that can be caused as a consequence of the Iranian and Hezbollah response is likely to come from Lebanon. I don't know how many minutes, 12, 15, 20 minutes it takes a cruise missile.
No. If it's an actual missile, not a cruise missile, it should be about 2.5 minutes.
Right.
And the alarm from Lebanon. From
right.
Iran, it could be a ballistic missile from Iran would take somewhere around 12 minutes.
12 minutes.
From Lebanon, that would be a rocket or a missile would be somewhere between 1.5 minutes and 2.5 minutes. And it's assumed that Tel Aviv residents will get a 90-second alarm. That's quite short. It takes time to actually move yourself to a shelter, whether it's a safe space within your home. Not everybody has that, of course. And that's troubling. It's closer. It's a bigger arsenal. It has the Hezbollah actually has better missiles than the Iranians have, and of course, it's much closer.
Right.
So this is more troubling than Iran in a way.
Right. That's my point, and it raises the issue of saturation. Mm-hmm. We talked earlier in those 34 days in the summer of 2006, Hezbollah launched total somewhere in excess of 3,000 missiles. The IDF is reporting that between October and July, the total number of high trajectory projectiles, I don't know whether that includes anti-tank weapons or not, which are increasingly effective, was 9,000. I mean,
so I spoke to a general today. The number is around 7,000, just the missiles and rockets. But as you said, there are anti-tank missiles as well.
And if Hezbollah can launch 3,000 projectiles a day, that raises
that's in case of a war, a full scale. That would mean a war.
Exactly. Yeah. So it won't be saturation. It obviously will be something that between Israeli air defenses, I don't know about drones, they're perhaps much more difficult to actually detect, but between Israeli air defenses and what the US has deployed, you would suspect that Israeli defenses could handle most of what Hezbollah intends to launch. Is that a fair assumption?
Handle, yes, but the number of casualties and the damages would be very different than anything that we've encountered before. I've just received the numbers for the Hamas attack on October 7th. I was just told today the exact numbers. If I'm not mistaken, there were 4,000 rockets, 3,000 rockets shot within 3 hours. 7 people died, 14 people died, I think, altogether in 2 days. 7 in the first few hours. These are the actual numbers, but this is very, very different. There's more firepower. The warheads are heavier. Hezbollah has accurate missiles, something that Hamas never had. More drones, of course, and the sheer numbers are huge. So if you talk of an attack of better missiles and rockets launched simultaneously within 2 or 3 hours, the results could be relatively devastating, considering what we've gotten used to in the past.
Right. So let's look at the logic chain here. If Nasrallah talks about a new phase. If the purpose of the Hezbollah strike is to actually cause Israel a degree of pain and do significant damage, not to mention what the Iranians plan, but again, as you pointed out, Hezbollah is the key threat here, then it raises the question whether or not there is a containable, we're looking at a containable back and forth. I mean, if your assumption is that Hezbollah is out to cause real pain, then the Israeli response, proportionate, disproportionate, could easily escalate into something that looks like a sustained confrontation, not a one-off or a two-off. So we don't know what Hezbollah is actually going to do. But as we look at the range of possibilities for an Israeli response, what are you thinking?
First and foremost, this depends on something that you know very well from the past, which is the number of casualties. Israelis, even now, are terribly sensitive to deaths, whether it's civilian deaths or soldiers dying in action. This has always affected Israeli policies and Israeli response. If you go back to Sharon's policies during the Second Intifada, time after time, his decisions to act, that was mostly in the West Bank at that time, the early 2000s, and you remember that very well, it all depended on the numbers of bodies, actually. It seems quite morbid, but this is the truth. If the IDF knows exactly where to wait for them, so to speak, and is ready to intercept, and most of the attack is blocked or fails, then perhaps Israel has more leeway to decide how to act on the offensive. Two things are very clear to me: that Hezbollah is about to act in some way, and that Israel would react. And yet, everything else depends on the numbers, the number of casualties, and the damage, and how symbolic the targets are, and how successful Israel feels about intercepting this. Because if we go back to April 13th, 14th, Iran launched 330 rockets, missiles, projectiles,
right,
including drones and cruise missiles and so on. Iran and its proxies, not including Hezbollah. Hezbollah stayed out of that one. But there were Shiite militias in Syria and in Iraq, and I think the Houthis in Yemen took part in this as well. And yet, because only one rocket hit one Israeli Bedouin girl in the Negev who was severely injured, the Israeli government could afford a very specific reaction, hitting one target in Iran, a significant one, an S-300 anti-aircraft system that apparently is part of the defense around Iran's nuclear project. But this was a message to Tehran. It wasn't a message to the region. It wasn't something that the Iranian people felt badly about. And of course, the immediate result of that was that gradually things, not so gradually, things died down and the tension was evaporating. This is not the case right now. It's much more dangerous right now. And listening to Nasrallah's threats, it could be more serious. Having said that, I'm not sure that Nasrallah is about to start a war. I think that after 2006, you know the quotes about him regretting the decision to strike and to kidnap soldiers at that time. I think he hasn't been an asset to Israel, of course. He's been behind the depths of many Israelis. He's a close advisor to Khamenei. I think in a way he holds the Israeli portfolio in the Iranian regime after Qasem Soleimani had died. He's considered an expert on Israeli society. And yet, to some extent, I may be wrong on this, and I may be proved wrong very quickly. And yet, in my view, he is somewhat deterred by what he knows about Netanyahu and the Israeli army's capabilities.
Right. So you use the word deter. Let's just for a second.
A terrible concept.
Talk about deterrence, because I mean, it just seems to me that Israel has a strategic problem with Hezbollah. We'll get to Iran in a minute, but they don't have a strategic solution to Hezbollah. Their problems with Hezbollah range from the fact that you've got 60 to 80,000 Israelis who have been relocated since October 7th out of fear of cross-border incursions by Hezbollah's elite forces. We're now entering the 11th month of that displacement, and there's no indication that those Israelis will move back to their homes and their businesses anytime soon. So that's one problem. Then you've got the issue of Hezbollah's inventory of high trajectory weapons, including among them hundreds of precision-guided missiles, which could be extremely dangerous, not in the thousands, presumably in the hundreds. So that's another problem. So walk me through how Israel navigates this. You're not going to solve, seems to me, either of those two strategic problems unless the Israelis decide to mount a major ground incursion into southern Lebanon and push, I don't know how many forces, Radwan forces they have deployed there, north of the Litani. But then that raises the question, who's going to stop them from returning? And if you go to strike, to do a strategic strike on the missile capacities, then you're into the Dahya doctrine. Then you're into destroying Lebanese infrastructure. Then you're into mass casualties. So deterrence really isn't the issue here, is it? It's kind of just getting, I'm sad to say, like getting back to the same strategic problem. Because no Israeli strikes are going to solve either of the problems that I've identified. Or am I completely wrong?
No, you're not wrong at all. First of all, briefly regarding deterrence, and this is a concept that Israel has been discussing for years and trying to find solutions in order to avoid full-scale wars. Because in the end, especially the old Netanyahu, the pre-October 7th Netanyahu, as we both know, has been quite careful not to start any unnecessary wars that he knew he didn't know how these wars would end for him. So there was a lot of talk about deterrence and perhaps a lot of exaggerations. Every time after a round of violence in Gaza, which was never decisive, the generals and Netanyahu said that Hamas was weakened and deterred. And yet we've seen how this played out on October 7th. So it's hard to say. It's quite elusive. And the whole concept, you only know how much deterrence worked for you when it's no longer there. If that ended on October 7th, then we know in retrospect that we didn't have enough deterrence against the Hamas. So I think I find a lot of this discussion futile right now. I don't think it's extremely important. Regarding the issue itself, as you said, what we have now for the last 10 months, Hezbollah didn't join completely. What happened was, in a way, that this was discussed among the Axis members, the possible attack against Israel. But Sinwar did not tell his counterparts in Hezbollah or his minders in Tehran what he was up to, and he surprised them completely by storming the Israeli border from Gaza on that morning. And they had an important decision to make, and they decided not to join, to fully join. Nasrallah would say, look, I've forced the Israelis to deploy 3 divisions there on the northern border because they're so scared of me doing the same thing that you did down south. And this is why, in a way, Israel could not destroy Hamas completely because it had to focus on the northern border as well. And yet what they're gradually doing, they are focused on standoff attacks, shooting missiles, launching rockets, anti-tank missiles, as you mentioned, drones, and so on. But there are no Hezbollah incursions into Israeli soil. Right. So this is how this has played out. And the danger, one danger you mentioned, is a repeat of what has happened, a rerun of what has happened in a much more devastating, from a much more devastating threat on the north, what happened in the south earlier. The other is this war of attrition that they're playing, and it could be worse. They could be launching 3,000 rockets a day and not 50 or 60 the way they do now. So this is what Israel has to deal with. Now, the Biden administration has been saying, and most of the security apparatus in Israel as well has been saying, look, the way to solve Lebanon, at least for the time being, is to go through Gaza, reach a ceasefire in Gaza, reach a hostage deal, allow the end of fighting there, and Hezbollah would magically stop. It's quite clear. He's made his intentions quite clear. Some people are saying that Nasrallah is dying to stop, that he's lost he's lost the 400th fighter this afternoon. This is for a small organization. 400 deaths among its members in 10 months is quite significant. So I'm not sure that he's happy to continue this war of attrition. He's losing more soldiers than Israel is losing in this war. And yet, how do you solve this? As you said, if we've seen what they're capable of doing, we know that they have this intention. We know that there could be a surprise attack in a year or 2 years. What would these 60,000, 70,000 people do, even if they were returned to their villages? How would they feel safe to stay there if Radwan is on the other side? Radwan is the name of Hezbollah's elite forces. So many Israelis are saying, look, the dilemma is quite simple. It's either act now, and considering everything we've been through, considering that the country is exhausted, that the reservists are exhausted, that the army has fought for so long and so on, yet we don't have much choice. This would be one way of dealing with that. Others would be saying, let's wait a while, a year or two, but we don't count on Hezbollah. We don't believe Hezbollah's good intentions. We don't believe the international community because it failed miserably. Remember, after 2006, decision 1701 by the UN Security Council, it was never implemented. Right. Hezbollah stayed south of the Litani from the first day after the ceasefire was announced. These people are saying, look, at one point or another, we'll either find our excuse or be given one, and then we'll hit Hezbollah, but then we will be much readier. A small group of Israelis still believes that a diplomatic solution could continue for a long time. But I have to admit that I'm doubtful as well, considering everything that has happened, both on Gaza and on the Lebanese border since October 7th.
Right. So let's turn let's move farther south and turn to Gaza. Just to conclude, so the best outcome that is likely to occur, the worst is clear. An escalation that leads to a massive Israeli-Lebanese war, which escalates, involves the U.S. and Israel and Iran. But the best outcome then is literally to return to something that we've been dealing with, watching for the past 10 months, with the possibility of a ceasefire in Gaza that would at least stabilize the Israeli-Lebanese border. Is that, to put a cap on it, is that the best outcome?
Look, there are no good solutions. I'm doubtful whether there were any good solutions since '93. And Oslo, we can discuss Oslo for hours, but I think
yes, I
don't think you have the time or the patience to go back to that right now. And yet, one of the problems here, again, I write for Haaretz. It's a liberal newspaper. We support the newspaper's political line is support of the two-state solution, even now and so on. And I believed in that for many, many years. And yet, Israelis on the center left have a problem right now. Even if we despise Netanyahu and we criticize Netanyahu and we feel that he is to blame for most of what has happened, on top of the military fiasco and the intelligence fiasco. The right wing has a point regarding faith, regarding the level of trust you can have in any kind of a solution on the Gaza border. In the end, one thing that Netanyahu was, in my view, quite accurate about in the beginning after October 7th was this equation that some people are saying is false: Hamas equals Daesh, equals ISIS. Never mind now the ideological differences, the atrocities, the pure evil that was shown at the Gaza border kibbutzim and those communities on that day. This is something that is as deeply, not only hurt, but as deeply affected every Israeli. And the fear that this could repeat itself, that maybe there will be another intelligence fiasco, maybe next time in 5 years, the army would be caught off guard again. This is very, very troubling. Right. And then, so many Israelis are saying, look, you need to defeat Hamas completely because you cannot have ISIS as your next door neighbor. It's not happening 7,000 miles away. It's happening 1,000 yards away. This is the distance between Kibbutz Nahal Oz and the Sajaiya neighborhood. And the fact that the IDF has destroyed the Sajaiya neighborhood does not mean that Hamas fighters would not come back there very soon. So again, what you could say is, okay, we need a solution with the Palestinian Authority. Makes sense. And yet, this is exactly the card Netanyahu keeps playing to the Israeli public. Can we count on them? It's actually the same thing. These are Hamas members wearing nicer masks. This is what he's actually saying. And this is the root of the matter. The problem, of course, is that Netanyahu has not shown that he's able to defeat Hamas completely. Not just Hamas as an idea, Hamas as a military organization, Hamas's leadership. It's not intact, but Sinwar is still there. So perhaps it's not a problem for Netanyahu because, as I said, I suspect that he wants a continuous war of attrition. It serves his political motives more than any other solution right now.
But again, it's the same sort of equivalent of the strategic problem that Israel, well, a different sort of strategic problem. Let's just describe the Gaza Palestinian Hamas problem as a major problem without a solution. I mean, you can't destroy an idea. This idea is obviously very objectionable. Hamas's embodiment of an idea, the replacement of Israel by an Islamic State. But you can make an idea less relevant. You can make an idea less relevant. And here we get into the question of what emerges, what is victory in your mind? Hamas survives as an insurgency of some kind with the capacity to intimidate and co-opt whatever political governing scheme is envisioned for Gaza. It's not going away. It's not going to rule Gaza again, but it's not going away. Since there's no security architecture to replace and guarantee stability, Israel will continue to operate in and out. The Palestinian Authority is not in no position to assume any sort of control or authority. The Arab states are not going to put their boots on the ground without making Gaza first part of some broader plan to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. Nobody can even envision how to even begin to do that. That's, it seems to me, a pretty grim outline. And the best you're going to be able to do, and I want to ask you now about the ceasefire agreement. Do you think, assuming we get through this crisis without a major explosion, do you think it's conceivable to imagine Israel and Hamas signing on to at least a phase one of the three phases, a 6-week ceasefire for 33 Israeli hostages, the women, the elderly, the infirm, for a 6-week ceasefire, and I don't know how many Palestinian prisoners, many who have killed Israelis, being returned in the trade? Is that even possible?
So this is very frustrating because in the end, what you've outlined earlier is what many people on the Israeli side are hoping for, some kind of an agreement, perhaps an involvement of Gulf states, perhaps American involvement, a PA-related force, and so on. And this has been discussed or suggested since December of last year. And yet Netanyahu kept refusing to deal with that. He repeatedly refused to discuss any kind of a day-after solution. Every now and then, under enormous pressure, both from the army's top brass and from the Biden administration, he would let it slip that he maybe there should be a discussion in the future with certain conditions, but nothing actually happened. And so much has been going on for 10 months, and yet nothing has moved on the political level. We haven't seen any kind of presence of the Palestinian Authority. And Hamas, Gaza is still a Hamas stronghold. There's no full Israeli control. There are not many Israeli soldiers. There's not much fighting going on, actually, right now. So this goes back to the question of what an actual win is, what an Israeli victory is.
Yes.
And I'm not sure how many of your audience have actually followed that, but Netanyahu has been selling this very, I don't know, a very simple slogan, but it's something that's absolutely unbelievable to me, which is complete victory. It's like "Make America Great Again." Okay, there are actually his supporters are selling hats, baseball caps with this slogan of total victory. And he made a point of taking a picture with Trump at Florida while Trump hosted him there with that hat. And there's gossip that people around him are actually trying to make money out of this, business of selling those hats.
Parallels are striking.
Yeah. So again, going back, so this is how he represents it to the Israeli people, and yet most Israelis are saying, "Look, 10 months, the kibbutzim, the communities of most of them are not have not come back yet to their homes. Many of those homes were destroyed, of course, by Hamas. And there's no total defeat of Hamas. There's still rockets. Rockets were launched yesterday, perhaps not to the center of the country, but Hamas still has capabilities. We haven't defeated them completely. Is the alternative a ceasefire? Yes, again, most of Galan, the Minister of Defense, and most of the heads of the different Israeli security branches would tell you, yes, the solution right now, considering all the other options, it's not the best alternative. It's not the best possible scenario, but it's the best alternative we have, and we can go for a ceasefire. As you know, Netanyahu has his objections. One regards the Netzarim corridor, the control of a corridor that divides the Gaza Strip in half between the north and the south, and the other is what's called in Israel the Philadelphia corridor, the Rafah corridor around the Egyptian border. He wants control of those two corridors, while his military men, his top brass, have been saying for quite some time, look, we can't demand this. We need to find other solutions right now. There's a possibility to somehow bypass these issues. It's not such a big danger considering all the damage we brought on Hamas. And what we get back are those hostages. Now, you mentioned 33. I'm not sure that the numbers actually add up to 33 live hostages.
They may not.
Some of these could be bodies. And yet there's hope. The families, of course, are demanding this. And again, I mentioned earlier the fact that Israelis put such a high price on casualties. The hostages issue, it's a small country. Americans speak of 6 degrees of separation. In Israel, you have 1 degree of separation. Almost everybody knows everybody. Everybody I know knows one of the hostages, has personal feelings about the outcome, the fate of a certain hostage. So if you look at all the public opinion polls, 70% of the Israelis are willing to go forward with this deal, even considering what you mentioned, that hundreds of terrorists who murdered Israelis in cold blood would be set free as well. There's huge support for that. And yet Netanyahu has not shown any real interest in moving this deal ahead. And this is, of course, for political reasons. We haven't mentioned this at all during all the time we spoke. But his specific position right now is all about political survival. He needs to remain in power. He needs to delay the legal proceedings against him. He's still standing trial for 3 different counts of corruption, and he desperately needs to stay in power. And therefore, he relies entirely on the support of 2 extreme right-wing parties that oppose such a deal. And that's the main issue. Some of the journalists who are close to him are saying, look, he's playing a game. He's trying to apply more pressure. There will be more assassinations against Hamas. And finally, Sinwar either dies or becomes more flexible and allows a better agreement. Yeah. And yet, one of the problems is that the clock is ticking. Hostages are dying there, whether murdered by Hamas or because they're sick and held in terrible conditions, or sometimes killed by mistake by Israeli bombing. So we don't have all the time in the world.
Governing is about choosing, Amos, and leaders or non-leaders set certain priorities. And we didn't mention it, but there's no question the overriding organizing principle of Benjamin Netanyahu's world is survival. And the magic
What's good for Netanyahu? Yeah.
Netanyahu, 64. And there's no effective opposition. And the Knesset is now in recess. It won't come back until the end of October. That means Benjamin Netanyahu will be in a position to assess who the next president of the United States is and how to comport his government in response. And elections at the earliest sometime in 2025. We're really nearing the end, but I wanted to ask you, as an Israeli, David Remnick has a profile of Yahya Sinwar in the latest issue of the New Yorker, and you have a quote here that I want to read. Quote, "The sense in Israeli society is that we are going down the drain, and Sinwar has helped drag us there. When we justify things we never would have justified before, we are in the moral gutter. Words like revenge used to be heard only among the Bezalel Smotriches and the Itamar Ben-Gavirs of the world. Now military units and mainstream colonels are using terms like nakama, revenge, in Hebrew. It's almost part of the norm now. I'm not sure it was part of Sinwar's great plan, but that is where we are. Keeping in mind the double standards, keeping in mind the slaughter that occurred in the wake of October 7th. Is there any sense that in response to the trauma, that has been inflicted on Israelis and Palestinians by Israelis, that you have any sense in the months ahead that there can be some sort of alternative pathway or counter trauma?
Look, I have to believe in that. I stay in this country. I'm a Zionist. I still believe in the original ideas, but it's harder and harder to stick to them and to be hopeful and optimistic about the future, considering everything that has happened. Part of the problem here, as I mentioned to David, is the fact that these atrocities have driven the country, the Israeli society, almost crazy. And since I talked to David, and since this was printed, there's a new story breaking in Israel, which has to do with sort of an Israeli Abu Ghraib jail, if you'd like. All kinds of.
Right.
It's not only Palestinian accusations; it's actually the military police who are now investigating such charges against Israeli reserve soldiers who presumably tortured and even raped a Palestinian prisoner.
Right.
So this is, again, I'm not saying that this never happened in 48. Perhaps it did, and perhaps there were terrible events in the war of what we call the War of Independence during that time. And yet we've moved forward. We've become in many ways a westernized liberal society in spite of the occupation and in spite of the problems with the Palestinians. But some of the things that are happening right now, it's hard for me to acknowledge that this is the Israel I know and I grew up in. It's very, very hard. Like many other Israelis, I'm having a very, very hard time accepting this. I hope that things would improve. But I find it difficult to believe in that, considering what's happening around us right now, everything that we've discussed, including the Hezbollah threat, and also considering our current leader. The fact that Netanyahu has been in power for so long is very problematic exactly regarding these issues.
I'll quote Jack Kennedy to finish here: idealism without illusion. And you clearly have it. I also want to thank you for coming on Carnegie Connects and sharing your wisdom, your authority, and I hope for better days as well. So be safe, be well, and let's hope the next conversation you and I have, things haven't gotten worse. I would accept that. I'd accept that, Amos, as an outcome, at least for now.
Thank you.
Take care. Be well.
You too.